and restore its glory. For a while, people believed his words. But behind the parades and speeches, Italy was falling into fear, war, and destruction. Yet his reign of terror didn't last long, and his story ended in the most twisted way the world could imagine.
The world remembers Benito Mussolini as the iron-fisted dictator of Italy, the man who promised glory, built an empire of fear, and ultimately plunged his nation into devastation. But very few know the truth about his last 24 hours, the final chapter of his life where the once invincible leader was reduced to a fugitive, a terrified man on the run, begging shadows for mercy that would never come. The ending of Mussolini's story is not a clean historical footnote. It is chaotic, disturbing, and almost impossible to stomach, because the closer we look at his final day alive, the more horrifying it becomes. Betrayal, panic, lies, torture, and a finale so brutal that even hardened soldiers struggled to look at his remains. Tonight, we peel back the curtain on the final 24 hours of Benito Mussolini, the dictator who believed himself untouchable, only to learn that history has a way of collecting its debts. This is Epoch Secrets, and this story is not for the faint of heart. The final 24 hours of Benito Mussolini's life did not begin with a gunshot or a violent confrontation. They began with denial, a desperate, trembling denial that the world he built was collapsing faster than he could run from it. For years, Mussolini projected himself as a titan, the founder of fascism, the man who dreamed of reviving the Roman Empire, the leader whose speeches could whip crowds into frenzy. But by April 1945, his empire had crumbled to dust, his armies were defeated, his allies had abandoned him, and even Hitler, his closest ideological partner, was trapped in a bunker, awaiting death. On the night of April 26th, Mussolini sat inside the prefecture building in Milan, surrounded by the last loyal remnants of his fascist government. He looked exhausted, hollow-eyed, and visibly aged, far beyond his years. Reports from those present said he spoke rarely, instead staring into space as if trying to piece together an escape route from a maze that had already closed around him. Outside the building, the sounds of gunfire and destruction grew louder by the hour. Milan was no longer his city. It belonged to the resistance, now men and women who had seen their families punished, imprisoned, or executed under his regime. Inside the room, his ministers argued over plans, alternative routes, and escape strategies. Some believed that fleeing north toward Switzerland might save them. Others insisted that the German military convoy still stationed in Como could help them cross the border. But Mussolini barely responded. His silence terrified everyone present. This was not the fire-breathing dictator who once bragged that he would die before surrendering. This was a man whose power was evaporating by the second. By dawn on April 27th, Mussolini finally stood up. He didn't give a speech. He didn't rally his men. Instead, he said the 6 words that shocked his loyalists: "I must leave, right now." With that, Mussolini grabbed his coat and prepared to vanish into the night as a fugitive, slipping away from the same people he had ruled with an iron hand. He wasn't alone. At his side was his mistress, Clara Petacci, a woman many describe as fiercely loyal, even to the point of obsession. Witnesses said she refused to leave him, despite pleas from her own family. She believed Mussolini would survive. She believed she would escape with him. She believed she knew the man behind the dictator. What she didn't know was that they were both walking into a nightmare. Outside, a German convoy made up of trucks and soldiers prepared for departure. Mussolini, terrified of being recognized, disguised himself in a German overcoat and helmet. For the first time in decades, he was hiding his identity, covering the face that once appeared on coins, newspapers, posters, and monuments. The mighty Il Duce had become just another man desperately praying not to be seen. The convoy began moving north along Lake Como. But, The Italian resistance, now everywhere and nowhere at once, had established roadblocks and checkpoints across the region. They knew Mussolini was trying to escape. They knew his time was almost up. And then it happened. At the small village of Dongo, the convoy was stopped by a partisan roadblock. The German soldiers argued, insisting on passage. A tense standoff unfolded as partisans searched each truck, demanding identification from everyone aboard. Mussolini remained still, hidden under the German coat, his eyes fixed on the ground. But something about him, perhaps the rigid posture, the tension in his movements, or the sheer fear radiating from his body, caught the attention of a partisan fighter. The soldier shouted, "Who is that man?" and moved closer. Mussolini didn't speak, but Clara Petacci, shaken and emotional, unintentionally drew attention to them. A partisan recognized her instantly, and if Clara was there, Mussolini could not be far. Mussolini's disguise was ripped away. His German coat was torn off, his helmet pulled from his head. The man underneath was exposed. The dictator who once controlled an entire nation now stood trembling before his captors. His face was pale, his hands unsteady, and he offered no resistance. For a man who ordered the imprisonment and execution of thousands, he seemed incapable of even raising his voice. The partisans were stunned, not because they found Mussolini, but because of how he looked. Witnesses described him as broken, defeated, and without any spark left inside him. He was no longer a leader. He was simply a frightened man, clutching onto the last minutes of his life. The partisans arrested him, separating him from Clara. She screamed, begged, and threw herself at the fighters, insisting that she be taken wherever he was taken. But the partisans refused to entertain any plea for mercy. They marched Mussolini into Dongo, where a furious crowd had already gathered. Word spread like wildfire. Mussolini has been captured. People swarmed the streets, many shouting insults, others simply staring in disbelief. This was the man responsible for decades of misery, and he was finally powerless. Locked inside a small, damp room, Mussolini sat in silence while the partisans debated their next move. Some wanted him delivered to Milan for public judgment. Others wanted him held until Allied forces arrived. But many argued that Mussolini was too dangerous to remain alive another day. His supporters could still attempt a rescue. Germany might still interfere. There was no guarantee he wouldn't slip away again. Meanwhile, Clara Petacci refused to leave his side. She pleaded with guards, tried bribing, arguing anything to be reunited with the man she loved. Eventually, she was placed in a separate house nearby, her fate tied to his, no matter how much the partisans wanted to avoid harming her. Inside the room, Mussolini was asked repeatedly if he had anything to say, but all he offered were short, cryptic statements about destiny, fate, and how the world had turned against him. He knew he wasn't going to make it out alive. That night, Mussolini barely slept. He sat awake, staring at the wooden floor, gripping his knees with trembling hands. Witnesses said he appeared haunted, as though he were replaying every speech, every order, every execution he had ever commanded. Outside, the partisans kept guard, discussing what would happen at dawn. The sun rose on April 28th, Mussolini's final morning on Earth. By this point, the decision had been made. A partisan leader named Walter Audicio was given the task of execution. Mussolini was to be taken to a remote location and shot immediately. No trial, no final statements, no theater. When guards entered the room to retrieve him, Mussolini's expression didn't change. Reports say he stood silently, preparing himself for the inevitable. He didn't plead, he didn't bargain, he simply accepted that the end had arrived. Clara Petacci, however, reacted very differently. When she saw Mussolini being escorted outside, she screamed and forced herself into the group, insisting that she would not let him die alone. Partisans tried to push her aside, but she clung to Mussolini, refusing to let go. Against orders, Against every attempt to separate them, she stayed glued to his arm. And in the end, they took her too. The convoy moved toward a quiet roadside near the village of Giulino di Mezzegra. The air was cold, the road was empty. Birds chirped, unaware of the grim event that was about to occur. When they reached a stone wall beside a rural house, the order was given. This would be the execution site. Mussolini and Petacci were positioned against the wall. Clara refused to step away. She wrapped her arms around Mussolini and shouted at the partisans to shoot her first. But they ignored her. The guns were raised. Mussolini didn't speak. He didn't resist. He simply stared forward, a hollow shell of the man who once ruled a nation through fear. The shots rang out. Multiple rounds hit Clara first, killing her instantly as she clung to Mussolini. Then, bullets tore into Mussolini's body, sending him collapsing beside her. His final moments were not heroic, not defiant, not grand. They were quiet, empty, almost pitiful. But the horror did not end with death. The bodies were loaded into a truck and transported to Milan, where they were hung upside down in a public square known as Piazzale Loreto, the same place where fascists had previously executed partisans. The symbolism was exact. The vengeance was brutal. Crowds gathered. People screamed, cursed, and threw objects at the lifeless bodies. Some spat, others kicked. It was raw, unfiltered fury unleashed upon the dictator who had caused so much suffering. The images of Mussolini and Petacci hanging from a metal beam would go on to shock the world, but for the people of Italy, it was closure, it was justice, it was the final end of a dark chapter. The man who once dreamed of restoring a Roman Empire died not in a palace, not on a battlefield, but on a roadside wall, executed like a criminal, then displayed for the world to see. His final 24 hours revealed the truth he could never escape. Power is fleeting, fear is temporary, and every tyrant eventually faces a moment where no army, no propaganda, and no ideology can save them. Mussolini believed he would be remembered as a visionary, but in the end, he was remembered for something far different: how violently and humiliatingly his downfall unfolded. In those last 24 hours, they are a reminder that history always catches up, no matter how fast you try to run. The final day of Benito Mussolini wasn't just the collapse of a dictator, it was the collapse of an illusion. It showed the world that even the most powerful regimes can crumble in an instant, and it revealed what happens when a leader builds his legacy on fear, cruelty, and blind ambition. If you want more shocking, untold final hour stories that history books whisper about but rarely explain, make sure you subscribe to Epoch Secrets, because the past has a dark side and we're here to uncover every part of it. Until next time, question everything, fear nothing, and keep digging for the truth that others try to bury.